Is there a free market libertarian argument against the legalization of recreational drugs? That's the subject of this week's Point of Order podcast. Hi, I'm Joseph Benamy. Thanks for listening. On January 1st, the possession, use, and sale of marijuana became legal in the state of Colorado, and if ballot initiatives in a handful of other states are successful, legalization of marijuana and more could soon become a trend in America rather than the novelty it now is. Libertarians, along with many liberals and even some small government conservatives in Canada, would also like to legalize, or at least decriminalize, the possession and use of recreational drugs, particularly marijuana, and to regulate their production and trade. When asked to explain why, they typically offer one or more of three reasons. First, that the decision to use recreational drugs is a personal moral decision that the government has no business interfering with. Government, they say, has no right to impose anyone's moral code on anyone else. A second argument advanced in support of legalization is that it'll reduce the violence currently associated with the drug trade which, it's alleged, is the result of its current illegal status. Finally, legalization advocates point out that society's attitude towards recreational drugs has changed. It's become more tolerant over the years, and they argue that the law should be changed to reflect those changed attitudes. Of course, these aren't the only arguments made in favor of legalization of recreational drugs, but they are, in my experience, the ones most often cited, not to mention the ones most widely accepted. In my opinion, they're not very convincing. Let's begin with the conviction that government has no right to impose anyone's moral beliefs on anyone else. This view is now widely held in legal and legislative circles, not just in Canada, but throughout Western society as a whole, and it's been used to justify a number of controversial legal reforms in recent years. But how sound is the argument really? It's generally accepted that the rule of law is a defining characteristic of all free societies. Rule of law is the principle that society, using the government as its agent, has the right, through the democratic process, to set standards of behavior that apply equally to all of its members, and that all of its members must obey or face punishment. We may debate whether certain standards and the laws that reflect them are reasonable in a free and democratic society, but that's a far cry from arguing in principle that society, through government, has no right to establish and enforce standards whatsoever. All laws either prohibit perceived bad behavior or they compel perceived good behavior based on the prevailing views of right and wrong, that's to say the prevailing moral views of society at any given time. Indeed, the very idea that freedom is good is a moral view, and the constitutional limits on the power and purview of government are designed to impose those views on those who may hold a different opinion. Saying, therefore, that government has no right to impose morality isn't just an argument against some laws, it's an argument against all laws. And because all free societies are dependent on the rule of law to maintain their freedom, it is, at its most basic level, an argument against liberty itself. I'll have more to say about this in a bit. For the moment, let's move on to the second reason cited in favor of legalization of recreational drugs, namely that their decriminalization will result in the reduction or elimination of violence associated with their trade. That's a neat theory, charming even, but it's one based entirely on wishful thinking and conjecture rather than hard evidence, or any evidence for that matter. In fact, the illegal trade in legal, that is to say prescription drugs, is a booming business in our society, controlled largely by, wait for it, violent criminal gangs. And then there's the practical issue of how to control the manufacture and sale of drugs such as crystal meth or crack cocaine, to name a few. Are we really going to create guidelines and issue licenses for the manufacture and sale of dangerous drugs such as these? Of course we aren't, nor to their credit are most advocates of legalization suggesting that we should. Their goal is the legalization of so-called soft drugs, like marijuana, which they contend is less dangerous than drugs like crystal meth and crack cocaine. Setting aside for the moment the question of whether or not marijuana is indeed sufficiently harmless to warrant its legalization, the problem with the argument is that it undermines its own premise that criminal violence is a problem that can and should be dealt with through legalization. If that were so, after all, it would obviously be true with all illegal drugs, not just marijuana. rendering the decriminalization of that drug alone pointless. Finally, there's the view that since society's attitudes toward drug use have changed, Canada's current laws should also be changed. I'll address this argument soon, but before I do, I'd like to take a minute or two to consider some of the arguments in favor of retaining the legal status quo vis-à-vis the production, distribution, and use of recreational drugs, and to see how well they comport to the classical liberal principles that libertarians and small government conservatives adhere to. In his second treatise on government, John Locke, one of history's great classical liberal thinkers and political theoreticians, writes that the purpose of law is not to restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. He observes that where there is no law, there is no freedom. Locke defines liberty as freedom from restraint and violence from others. But critically, he adds that this does not mean the freedom for any individual to do as he pleases, for, quote, who could be free where every other man's humor might domineer over him? Based on these criteria, it might seem that Locke would oppose the enactment of anti-drug laws. This conclusion is possible, however, if you apply the principles he articulates only to the possession and use of the drugs in question. Apply those very same principles to their manufacture and sale, and the conclusion is very different indeed. Let me explain. Let's assume for the moment that Locke would agree that the initial decision to purchase and use recreational drugs is a personal choice that should not be restricted by law. It doesn't follow from there that he would agree that the decision to manufacture and sell these drugs also falls into the category of personal choice that the government shouldn't interfere with. On the contrary, given the considerable physical harm done to the consumer through the use of this product, Locke would surely regard their manufacture and sale as a form of violence from others that government has not just the right but the duty to constrain. What's more, even if he did consider the original decision to use drugs a legitimate personal choice, Locke would lightly conclude that the dependency induced by many of these drugs constitutes an unjustified and therefore unlawful restraint on the liberty of the user, which government, once again, has not just the right but the duty to act against. Then why not punish the producers and suppliers and leave the consumers alone, since those consumers are only exercising their inherent right to make personal choices, including bad ones? Or to put the question in the context of the current public debate, why not preserve laws against production and distribution of dangerous drugs while decriminalizing their purchase and use? The answer is quite simple, really. If the production and distribution of such drugs remains a crime, then their purchase and consumption must also remain a crime, since it's the purchase and consumption of the drugs that fund their production and distribution in the first place. As for the assertion that users are just exercising their inherent right to make personal choices, even bad ones, it's worth reiterating that there is no such unconstrained right in a free society in libertarian philosophy. Let me repeat what Locke wrote. Liberty does not mean the freedom for any individual to do as he pleases. Indeed, given the indispensable role their money plays to the maintenance and, more importantly, to the expansion of the drug trade, a case can be made that consumers are in fact active participants in the very violence from others that Locke asserts the government is obliged to act against. Having said all of this, most thinking people will agree, regardless of their political persuasion, that there is indeed a difference between the use of drugs and their manufacture and supply, a difference that would justify treating one group, users, more leniently than the others, especially if those users are addicted to the chemical they're using. And that, you may be surprised to learn, is exactly what the law does now. While possessing small quantities of banned drugs for personal use remains a crime in Canada, the penalties prescribed for this are light relative to those imposed on producers and distributors. What's more, the criminal justice system, that's to say the police and the courts, exercise a great deal of discretion when it comes to prosecuting users. Virtually nobody is prosecuted in Canada anymore for simple possession. If they are, it's invariably in combination with other criminal charges stemming from illegal activities that are far more serious. In short, and in response to the issue that I left unanswered earlier, Canada's criminal justice system can and already does reflect changes in society's attitudes toward the use of recreational drugs. It provides both the police and the courts with the flexibility to treat each case as unique, and it does this quite sensibly while maintaining both the practical and the theoretical integrity of the law. Which brings me to the subject of so-called soft drugs like marijuana. The issue of marijuana isn't as simple as pro-legalization activists would have you believe. True, the harmful effects of regular marijuana use are less acute than most other illegal drugs, but that hardly means that use is benign. In the first place, there's every reason to believe that, like cigarettes, the long-term use of marijuana will lead to higher rates of cancer. There's also emerging evidence linking its long-term use to the development of schizophrenia later in life. Granted, that evidence has not yet been accepted as conclusive, but there is enough of it that, if marijuana were currently legal and readily available, the public would be demanding that it be pulled off the shelves and that its producers be held accountable for endangering the health of unwitting consumers. A second important consideration with marijuana is the effect its secondhand smoke has on others. In addition to the harm done by secondhand cigarette smoke, secondhand marijuana smoke has a psychotropic effect as well. In other words, quite unlike other drugs like crystal meth, heroin, or cocaine, or even tobacco or alcohol, marijuana use harms others by inducing unwanted intoxication in those exposed to it secondhand. That intoxication may be mild, but it's real nevertheless, and its long-term health implications have yet to be fully understood. All this is to say that if the manufacture and sale of marijuana were not already prohibited, there would in all likelihood be a popular campaign to make it so. For too long now, a small group of ill-informed activists have enjoyed free rein in the debate over the legalization and regulation of recreational drugs. It's time for that to end. There are sound, solid reasons why libertarians and small government conservatives should oppose the legalization of recreational drugs. Hopefully, it's not too late to make those arguments. That's this week's Point of Order podcast. Don't forget to visit our website, www.meaninstitute.org, where you can obtain conservative thought and analysis on a wide range of current events and public policy issues. That's www.meigheninstitute.org. Or send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. The address is pointoforder, all one word, @meaninstitute.org. That's pointoforder@meaninstitute.org. I'm Joseph Benamy. Thanks for listening.
With your